Hello everyone. I wanted to come here this evening and talk a little bit about a couple things that have been on my mind lately, specifically with respect to this situation around Patreon. I know I haven't been making many videos recently. It's been a little bit of a transitional period. I'm working on a couple other projects and we'll talk about that more in the coming future. I think it's pretty exciting and I hope you'll find it exciting as well. And perhaps some of you will even want to help create these things. But that's a story for another day. The story for today is what to do with Patreon. I currently have a couple Patreon accounts, neither of which is really bringing in that much money at the moment. So it's fairly easy for me to say that I feel as if I need to shut those down given their recent actions. Perhaps I will move on to another service like Subscribestar or something else that's available, but I'm going to be focusing a lot on a couple other projects, and I'm not exactly sure if the direct crowdfunding model is going to be the manner in which I fund that or even partially fund that. But if it is, I'll certainly let everyone know. That being said, whatever revenue is coming in via Patreon at the moment is going to be shut down because I'm going to shut down my Patreon account. And I recommend that even those with even more income do the same. And I understand that that obviously means to some extent there will be a degree of lost revenue. But that being said, we are in a very precarious situation in which if we follow our short-term incentives and try to maximize our short-term profits, we can very easily end up in a situation where we are capitulating to some of the most treacherous types of censorship and political coercion. And these types of patterns, this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit lately. I've been writing about it as well for the past year or so. And I think I wanted to go through, just to perhaps help justify in people's minds why they might want to really deeply consider switching, even if they're not really sure about the ethics of this current situation. Perhaps they don't necessarily agree with Sargon of Akkad. Perhaps they find the fact that this was done simultaneously, or Sargon's suspension was simultaneous with two other figures who are known to be, quite distasteful and quite racially biased and racially charged, and I guess as people might say, hateful in their rhetoric. In any case, that association is also not random. The fact that it was done in tandem and done as kind of a package deal is meant to, in many ways, associate some of Sargon's ideas with ideas that are completely different and come from a different philosophical base, are expressed quite differently, and have absolutely nothing to do with one another if you really follow their roots down to the context in question. But on the surface level, just associating someone like Sargon with other people who I won't even name because they're not even worth naming, who obviously say very racist things, it's a tactic. So why does any of this matter, or how do we understand it from a larger context or from a larger perspective? I think what we really have to do is understand, or we have to zoom out quite far. We have to actually realize that certain patterns can play themselves out at different scales and in different systems, and those patterns can look on the surface level quite different, but when you really start to understand the dynamics in question, you actually end up talking about the same pattern. And I think what we're seeing right now with respect to the way that we are observing certain types of technology platforms censoring their content creators, or the people upon whose contributions they actually depend, in a way that is rather tyrannical, in a way that is rather autocratic, in a way that is highly centralized, and really takes upon itself no real obligation to hear the voices of those who actually give the platform its value. Of course, it can make overt gestures. It can respond in ways that its PR department, or that these companies' PR departments, whether we're talking about Google or whether we're talking about Twitter or whether we're talking about Patreon, the the PR departments of these very large, very well-resourced companies can weave a very, and they can weave a pretty web, and they can basically take a story and they can respond to something, whether it be on social media or in any other context. They can really make it seem or feel to those people or to specific groups they care about as if they're actually taking people's considerations into account, and really weighing those in a way that is meaningful. But fundamentally, the driver of their behavior is going to be twofold. It's going to be A, a function of their economic incentives, and it's going to be B, an aggregation of the perspectives of those in the company, weighted in a way such that those at the tops of these companies' perspectives are going to generally carry far more weight in terms of the capacity to change the directions of these companies. So why am I saying that? What does this have to do with these larger patterns I was mentioning earlier? Well, I think what we're seeing, if you go back to one of my first essays that I was writing about Facebook, it was called Facebook, Our Contemporary Coliseum. I described to some extent the evolution of social media, and in a way, the early days of the internet and social media felt a lot like, or had a lot in common with the early days of human social evolution as well, in terms of kind of hunter-gatherer dynamics, sparse bands moving about plateaus or plains, hunting particular animals, or generally speaking, not very sedentary, not very large scale. In the early days of human, in the early days of humanity, this was hunter-gatherer behavior. In the early days of the internet, this was very small little web forums. This was independent web pages. This was the very early days of hierarchically structured indexes. Nobody had extreme dominance. Penetration of the internet itself hadn't really taken root. Smartphones were not a thing. So you really had this context that was not mature, and it was highly dynamic. It was not highly centralized. That hadn't occurred yet. But in the same way that the development of agriculture for civilization allowed for an extreme degree of intensification, I would argue that the particular shift in our social media and internet usage that began to occur around the late aughts, perhaps with the advent of Facebook, could be the primary marker of this particular phase transition. We saw a different mode of behavior emerge. That was the mode of the internet society, the internet sedentary society, the sedentary information agriculture industry. And that information agriculture, if you're wondering what the actual cash crop is, that would be you. That would be your behavior. That would be your content. That would be everything that you are generating by spending time within the domain, territory controlled by a particular internet company. This is fairly obvious if you think about it. At the moment, we exist in a effectively turf war for attention. Shit, my light just went out, so whatever. This video is going to be a little bit darker. I'm not going to stop, just making this in one go. Sorry for the poor quality. I'm shooting this on my iPhone. In any case, where were we? We were talking about the fact that the particular economics of behavioral agriculture online definitely parallel the structural changes in the kind of patterns of organization in the macroorganism that is society, that was civilization at first, and then is largely centralized internet civilization in this newer wave. And we have to then ask ourselves if it's random, if it is a coincidence in any way that we begin to see the same types of structures emerge to control these types of increasing, we begin to see these types of structures emerge, or the same types of control structures emerge to attempt to manage the complexity of large, growing, sedentary, or closed system hierarchies, so to speak, or hierarchies that those who are managing wish to keep somewhat closed, given that they depend on the large amount of either eyeballs in our current market, or addicted dopamine-driven brains, or in the previous market, people whose incentives did not lead them to either rise up against those who were governing their large architecture or agricultural areas, or exploit the systems in ways such that soil became no longer farmable and all the people ended up dispersing or moving on. So you fundamentally have to keep as many people as you can in a particular location, whether it's in the walls of Facebook or around your civilization, around your city-state, really, at these points in times, to be able to keep the aggregate pattern healthy, to keep the inflows and the outflows moving in a way that actually keeps the entity in question alive, so to speak. So Facebook would be alive, or Twitter would be alive, or Patreon would be alive, given that they have sufficient financial inflows to accommodate the outflows that they have in terms of their expenses, and obviously they would like to also make a profit. So inflows should exceed the outflows. In agricultural societies, this would have been basically the amount of, energy flows, the amount of human labor, the amount of animal labor. The outflows would have been basically food to sustain these cities, agricultural outflows and food. And so what we saw there was we saw the emergence of a command and control hierarchical society. We saw governance structures whose job it was, or who effectively emerged in very strict hierarchies that had no flows up in terms of the citizen or the average farmer's input into the king or monarch's decisions with respect to the trajectory or behavior of the particular society in question. And in our current day and age, what we are seeing is the fact that those who are in control of either Facebook or Twitter or Patreon are once again assuming the role of monarch, of authoritarian dictator, with respect to, at this point, the morality of what can and cannot be said on their platforms, the behavior that is acceptable and or unacceptable. This is being dictated from the top down. This is being stated, and I guess I'll include Apple in that. Recently Tim Cook's speech has begun to shift my perspective on Apple as well. So I'll probably be shifting my devices that I use fairly soon if they continue to think that it's okay to not just provide infrastructure, but to force opinion. It's a very dangerous and disturbing path. Why is this unsustainable? Why was it unsustainable when we first created agricultural systems? And why is it unsustainable today? Well, I would argue that it's unsustainable because of the fact that as the complexity of the entity in question, whether that's a large-scale city-state, agricultural sedentary city-state that is pre-technological, well, I guess not really pre-technological, but let's say something on the order of all the way from 10,000 years ago up until the advent of or stirrings about democracy prior to the French. Well, we'll go back to Athens. How about that? So something on the order of 8,000 years. So 8,000 years of this pattern. It survived a while, a very long period of time. But why did it fall apart? Well, the duration or the length of its life, I do not think it's not a coincidence that it took quite as long for it to fall apart in terms of the top-down governance structures that were implemented across civilizations throughout the globe. given that the rate of complexity and the rate of change was actually not that high across all of 8,000 years. If you look at the rate of change, if you look at, just take as a proxy population growth for humanity, and you look across the past 20,000 years, and it's a hockey stick, it's an exponential, and we are exploding. The population of humanity has exploded very recently. The complexity of humanity has exploded very recently. Very specific technologies throughout human history allowed for the intensification and the increased density of our civilizations. And so therefore it's not actually that surprising. It doesn't really say that much in terms of the robustness of top-down authoritarian type rule, given that it took so long for us to finally master a few of the technologies that allowed us to really begin to grow at extremely high rates. Mastering agriculture and actually really intensifying crop production was one of those, figuring out the fact that we actually couldn't just completely exploit the same soil again and again and again without synthetic fertilization or fertilization processes, without just completely entering collapse cycles was an interesting discovery. Sanitation was the discovery. The transmission of information via the printing press was one of the discoveries. All of these led to a dramatic intensification in the explosion of our technological capacity, our ability to sustain increasing numbers of human lives, and the general growth of society. And when that happened, it created an immense amount of complexity. And that immense degree of complexity exerted pressure on the system of control. So if you are a king, if you are a monarch, if you are someone who is tasked with organizing all of the goings-on of your society, the last thing you really want is for exponential growth to lead to exponential increase in complexity of your decision-making, because when that occurs, none of the patterns that are known to work really work anymore, and you have to figure everything out again. And doing so from the perspective of a centralized entity is very slow and generally not capable of doing so in sufficiently short time intervals. And so people begin to starve, things begin to fall apart, things begin to become chaotic, and heads roll, right? And this is where we see humanity begin to experiment with a different mode of thinking about how to configure the way we govern ourselves. We actually said, hey, it would be interesting if all the people who have perspectives on the world in all of the different places that they live, based on all of the different aspects of the reality that we're all a part of, with which they're in contact, add those perspectives up, and then we flow those perspectives from the bottom up to the top, and we use that distributed computation of perspective to reconfigure the behavior and composition of our decision-making apparatus at the top or at the middle of this structure. That would be pretty interesting. I wonder if that would help us deal with more complex problems. And it turns out it does. It turns out democracy, while it has its limitations, actually is more capable of dealing with complex adaptive growth, or adapting to complex growth, or the growth of complex systems or complex environments. Excuse me. Turns out that it actually is more capable. And the proof is in the pudding there. Basically, as we've seen throughout the past 100 years, democracies have effectively outcompeted every other structure on Earth. That being said, they've also generated the technologies that authoritarian regimes might use to undermine them. That's a story for another day, but we should really think about the parallels between this and our modern day technological infrastructure, because it's very similar. We had an early internet that was very similar to hunter-gatherer type dynamics. Then these large platforms have created immense sedentary wells of human behavioral resource that we don't own, they own, and exploit for their economic benefit. Of course, we are provided with services, but it's becoming increasingly clear that those services actually do a lot more damage, perhaps, than they actually add in terms of value to our lives. It's quite possible that the way in which these particular pieces of technology are configured are net negative on average when you really look at everything involved. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be in a world in which we presumably live in democracies, and yet the spaces, the virtual spaces in which we spend increasingly large percentages of our time are controlled by effectively absolute monarchs? And if you're on the right, you should probably not say that it's a private company, so they just get to decide. And if you're on the left, you might just be in favor of what they're saying now, but I would advise you strongly to consider the fact that the ethics, or the degree to which you agree with the ethics of authoritarian action, is quite proportional to whether or not the actions are being directed at you. And if someone can get the reins of that institution, or if someone can, for example, hack these centralized leviathans of technology, they can direct those resources at anyone they wish, and you might not be on the side you choose to be on. You might get a taste of that medicine. So not having those weapons around for the wielding might be a better idea. We might want to consider the fact that in the same way humanity decided that we needed to conceptualize new modes of governance, of self-governance, that allowed for information to flow from the high-resolution reality of experience across many different people's experience up to the modes of control and governance, that we need to think about our technology patterns in the same way, our technological development in the same way. We're entering a time of extreme complexity and growth, chaos in many ways. We don't understand what we've created. We've plugged ourselves into each other in ways that we were not well adapted to, in ways that are stressing us out, in ways that are making us suicidal, in ways that are making us fundamentally addicted, in ways that are making us narcissistic, in ways that are making us psychopathic. All of these aspects of human behavior, you can resonate with many different behavioral chords of humanity, and our current batch of technological platforms, I would say, are not necessarily resonating with our best impulses, with our best chords, if we were to be considered an instrument. And so this leaves us with this question of how do we actually move forward? And I would say, if we want to see a better landscape of technology emerge, oftentimes you have to go down before you go up again. We have to have courage. We have to make sacrifices. And so the sacrifices that will be asked of us are of different magnitudes and will come at different times. And for me at the moment, this Patreon situation is a small sacrifice. I've made larger sacrifices, many larger sacrifices, and I imagine there are more to come. This is a small sacrifice, but I'm trying to speak about it. I'm trying to have a discussion about it with people without any of the niceties or fancifulness of video editing or anything like that. Just a genuine kind of stream of consciousness exposition that I haven't thought much about until just a few minutes ago, when I felt that this had crossed a few lines that should not be crossed, and so that sacrifice is necessary. And you all might have different lines at which you feel comfortable. Well, I shouldn't even say you feel comfortable. You certainly do have a line at which you feel comfortable, but that is not, the line at which you feel comfort is quite different than the line across which you must step if you are to be courageous, such that we can actually create a better structure for technology. We can actually create the type of online communities and bottom-up decentralized systems that give us a fighting chance at coming anywhere near close to outcompeting the authoritarian structures that are being perfected right now in China, and which are being experimented with apparently quite broadly here in the United States from what we're seeing. It's a very unfortunate symmetry between some of what's happening in China at the moment and the way that people are beginning to censor themselves on online platforms. I was just watching Tim Pool's discussion of what happened with Sargon, and that's one of the reasons why I decided that I needed to make a video. I need to say something because of the fact that he wouldn't say a couple words. I think he wouldn't say swastikas, and he wouldn't say something else. I forget exactly what it was, but he wouldn't say these words, and they were on the screen, they were written, but you could tell that he was afraid of Google's AI flagging him and demonetizing him. He was afraid of what those who had control over his livelihood would do to him. This is happening in China with the social credit score. This is happening here with Patreon, with Google, with censorship, with demonetization. There's very little that is different about what's happening in China and their social credit score and what is happening here with demonetization based on political agendas. It's not that different, and the difference is becoming smaller every day. And people need to realize that. If you don't realize that, your eyes are not open. They just aren't. And just to wrap this up, I've been talking longer than I intended on talking about this anyways, but just to wrap this up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the manifest observable behavior concept that Jack Conte has claimed to be, or claimed as Patreon's objective frame of reference for making decisions around whether or not to allow content creators or entertainers to publish content on the Patreon platform or earn a living on the Patreon platform for publishing content elsewhere. Manifest observable behavior. We don't have quite enough time to fully unpack why it's impossible for such a structure to actually be objective, but it goes down to, or it really gets down to the core of some of the fundamental philosophical questions humanity's been grappling with for 2,000 years, probably longer. And essentially, though, the long and the short of it is that you might say that there's an objective observation of some event that happened in reality. Okay, so the event happened. That actually says nothing about what you're going to do about it. Manifest observable behavior, what does that even mean? It's jargon that basically is a wrapping paper around a fundamental truth that you're going to have to make decisions about what your values are with respect to what actions in this world you are going to support on your platform. If you say that you are going to have a policy that is discriminatory, that actually does draw lines and not just allows everyone, or allows the users themselves to decide, which is what I'm in favor of. I am in favor of systems that allow for emergent value systems to arise out of the interactions of human beings, out of dialogue, out of new models that allow for us to actually discover ways of coming to terms democratically as humans, finding consensus, breaking out of certain narratives and stories that bind us to unnecessary polarization. How can we do that? How can we create new tools for helping to create these kind of structures? That's what I'm interested in. But if you're not going to do that, if you're not courageous enough to allow for those types of platforms to emerge, or for that behavior to emerge on your own platform, because you're listening to your lawyers, because your VCs have a stake, because everyone wants their returns and nobody really cares as long as those people who are being noisy and making news that you don't like, the bad people, the racist people, whomever, they have to go, right? They need to be shut down. They need to be quiet. Stop making noise. You're getting in the way of my returns. You're getting in the way of my, you know, my desires to spend my time on other things, whatever it may be. You know, as soon as these types of controversies emerge and there's a centralized channel in place for deciding whether or not these people stay or go, there's going to have to be decisions made about values. There's no such thing as manifest observable behavior that is objectively analyzed or diagnosed, and this is just obvious proof of it. It's not just that, you know, it is that it's being interpreted in biased fashion here, but it's not just that. It's that the policy itself, you know, if you think about it, I guess if you know how to think, which apparently, you know, if Conti does, he is doing so in order to lie to people. Because if you think for more than 2 seconds about this concept, you know that at some layer, somebody's going to have to make value judgments. Somebody is going to have to draw lines in the sand about where the ethical boundaries lie. What kind of words are you going to allow? What kind of actions? What kind of deeds are you going to allow? We saw this with the Lord Southern debacle. They say perhaps it was violating a law. Whose law? Are you going to subject yourself to other countries' sovereign law? Are you going to do that with respect to whether or not somebody prevents immigration in a given country, but you're not going to do it with respect to data sovereignty? You're not going to agree to the fact that your servers must be in their countries? You're going to fight that in Washington while simultaneously saying that for political purposes you're going to deplatform people who are violating the sovereign laws of countries? That's inconsistent. Why did you make that decision? That's interesting. None of this is very manifest. Very little of it is observable. I mean, it certainly is behavior, but this is insanity. It's absolute insanity for anyone to believe for a second or take that as a sufficient answer to the question of, you know, how do you plan on enforcing these policies consistently? That is not a consistent answer. That is not a sufficient answer. It is barely even an answer. It is jargon. It is jargon, it is a disguise. It is jargon that it's kind of like a squid that can shoot its ink in your face and get away. Manifest observable behavior is the ink being shot in the eye of the public, of those who would otherwise like to see free systems, democratic systems, bottom-up systems, decentralized systems, systems that don't rely on a technocratic elite to make decisions about humanity's morality. So I guess I'll leave it there. And there are good things coming. I'm working on some interesting projects. I will be making some interesting videos. A lot tighter than this. This was all over the place. This was not my typical standards of quality, but I just had to get it out there. So I hope you enjoyed it to some extent. I'm going to be taking down my Patreon. I just need to get whatever money is on there at the moment off there, and then it's going to be gone. Maybe I'll do Subscribe Star at some point, maybe not. I'll let you guys know, but there are some other things in the works that are going to be, I think, much more interesting when it comes to fighting this battle. So I will let you know about those when there is more to say, more that I can't say. And until then, if you do have a Patreon account, I would advise you to, let's differentiate this. If you are a Patreon creator, you need to be courageous. You need to take the leap. You need to be willing to go down now, to go up later. It is possible that if you try to hold on to all of your money now, all you're doing is digging a deeper grave for yourself later, and for all of us. So you need to find the courage inside you to quit this addiction, this obviously pathologically dangerous addiction to a platform that is demonstrating the will and capacity to sever people's economic viability for political purposes. That is, we cannot, one cannot abide that if one believes in democracy, if one believes in freedom of speech, if one believes in any of these principles and any of these values over the long term that will help to guide us as a distributed system, as a society of equals. And then to the people who are not creators but are on Patreon or who are donating on Patreon, stop. Leave Patreon. Stop donating to people on Patreon. Say that you will only donate to other people, to your supporter or to your creators that you like. You'll only donate on platforms that are in line with your values. I know, Tim Pool explicitly said, don't unsubscribe from me. That's bullshit. Unsubscribe from him. Unsubscribe from everybody who does not actually align with your principles. There's nothing else to say about this. You have to be willing to make some sacrifices in the short term for these types of principles. We cannot simply say, oh, well, we'll see how it goes. I won't change my behavior. As a content creator, I won't take a hit economically. As a subscriber or supporter, I won't exert any political force here, or I won't exert any pressure, economic pressure, on the people that I like to watch or observe or consume, because of the fact that if that happens, the cycle just continues. It reinforces. The providers or the content creators will not leave because they're not losing any money, and they won't make decisions on principles apparently. And the content consumers will still have the content that they consume because they are, still have the content they consume on a platform that is subject to much larger disruptions in the future because they did not take a stand when they had the opportunity at a small scale, and therefore were left later down the road with much more negative and much larger and much worse repercussions. So be smart. I know it's extremely difficult. Try to imagine the future pain. Try to imagine the future in one hand, the future that could be created if we do nothing, the future that could be created if we continue to allow for centralized companies to grow, for governments to begin using these same strategies, the US government adopting the policies of China, the technologies of China. What kind of world that looks like? Do you want to live in that world? Because the path to that world is a world of inaction. The path to that world is a path of complacency and middling behavior that is not courageous, that doesn't actually look to the future and see where things are headed. Alternatively, you could take a little bit of a financial hit now. You could perhaps have a little bit less content to consume now, maybe 1 or 2 fewer videos a month, or a little bit, less than that. There's only, 100 million other videos to watch. You could take a little bit of a hit now. We could sacrifice a little bit of our desires, a little bit of our short-term wants and needs, such that we actually begin to direct the flow of economic resources and behavior into patterns that begin to turn us from fiefs in the fiefdom of technocratic slavery into those who actually take control of their self-governance online. And I know that's the world that I want to see. So I hope you do too.